She didn't question your loyalty to protect America, Tulsi Gabbard said evenly, her voice cutting through the hearing room with a calm that felt sharper than shouting. She questioned it because accusing patriotism is the fastest way to stop people from asking how power is actually being used. The audience watching at home reacted instantly, some leaning forward, others pulling back, all of them sensing that this wasn't a routine exchange, but the opening move of something far more dangerous and revealing. Why would a former speaker reach for such a loaded accusation so quickly? And why would Gabbard answer it with such deliberate restraint, instead of righteous anger? Here is my answer, and I'm placing it here deliberately so you know how to listen to everything that follows. Stay to the end of this video, because that first strike explains the entire architecture of what you are about to witness. This is not just about ideology or foreign policy disagreements, but about survival inside a system where accusations often matter more than answers. The hearing room itself seems designed to amplify moments like this, with its sealed walls, controlled acoustics, and the unspoken understanding that every word spoken here carries consequences beyond the room. On one side sits Nancy Pelosi, surrounded by the quiet machinery of experience, lawyers nearby, aides passing notes, and a posture that signals she has been in rooms like this long enough to believe she still owns them. Across from her sits Tulsi Gabbard alone, not because she lacks support, but because the visual itself reinforces her argument that power often hides behind numbers while accountability stands exposed. The cameras know exactly where to look because conflict has a gravity of its own, and gravity always pulls attention toward imbalance. Even before a single accusation is made, the audience can feel that something is different, because this exchange is not being staged for applause, but for consequence. Pelosi begins with the tone she has perfected over decades, measured, authoritative, and wrapped in the language of institutional responsibility. She speaks about intelligence oversight, alliances, and the dangers of misinformation, as if reciting from a script that has served her well across countless hearings and press conferences. There is comfort in her delivery, the kind that reassures supporters that the adults are still in charge, and that disruption is merely noise from the margins. Then comes the pivot, subtle at first, as she transitions from policy to person, from abstract risk to specific suspicion. It is the moment when the room tightens, because everyone understands that questioning loyalty is not an argument, but a threat. She doesn't need to say the word outright, because implication does the work for her, and implication is far harder to rebut without sounding defensive. By framing Gabbard's dissent as dangerous sympathy, Pelosi places herself on the side of safety and casts her opponent as a risk that must be managed. It is a move that has ended careers before, TVT, because once loyalty is questioned, every subsequent answer sounds like an excuse rather than a position. The irony, which the audience senses immediately, is that the accusation feels rehearsed, as though it was waiting for the first moment of vulnerability to strike. And this is where the first controversial question forms in the viewer's mind, which is why accusations of disloyalty so often appear when scrutiny starts pointing inward. Tulsi Gabbard does not rush to defend herself, and that choice alone disrupts the expected rhythm of the exchange. She sits still, her expression composed, forcing the room to linger in the discomfort Pelosi has just created, instead of letting it dissipate through argument. This pause is not hesitation, but strategy, because silence under accusation unsettles people more than denial ever could. When she speaks, she does not mirror the emotional register of the attack, because matching tone would mean accepting the frame Pelosi has set. Instead, she reframes the moment as a question of standards, And that reframing is the first crack in the structure Pelosi relies on. Gabbard anchors her response in service, but not as performance, and viewers can sense the difference because there is no flourish or demand for recognition. She speaks of oath and duty in a way that sounds lived in rather than marketed. And that authenticity shifts the audience's attention from rhetoric to credibility. Rather than arguing about motives, she questions processes, and rather than defending her identity, she interrogates behavior. This is the point where the hearing quietly changes from a test of loyalty into a test of accountability, and those two tests produce very different outcomes. The audience begins to ask a second dangerous question, which is whether loyalty accusations are meant to protect the country or protect the accuser. The humor, dark and understated, slips in through contrast rather than jokes, because the spectacle of power being challenged is inherently ironic. Pelosi's aides shuffle papers as if movement alone might regain control, while Gabbard remains still, as though motion would only dilute the weight of what she is saying. Viewers notice small details: a tightened jaw, a quick glance to counsel, the subtle signs of recalculation that rarely make it into official transcripts. It becomes almost absurd, in a grim way, that a discussion about national security feels increasingly like a conversation about personal insulation, and that absurdity feeds the sense that something long protected is being nudged into the light. Gabbard does not accuse directly at first, because direct accusations invite immediate denial and partisan noise. She instead outlines principles, the idea that power must be accompanied by transparency, and that oversight loses meaning when it exempts its most senior practitioners. By doing so, she invites the audience to draw its own conclusions, which is far more effective than telling them what to think. Pelosi attempts to steer the exchange back toward procedure, because procedure is where experience feels safest and where discomfort can be delayed. But procedure cannot fully contain a moment once viewers sense that the stakes have shifted from policy disagreement to ethical reckoning. This is where my own view becomes unavoidable, because moments like this reveal a pattern that has repeated across American politics for years. When dissent challenges the comfort of established power, the response is rarely engagement, but delegitimization, because delegitimization is quicker and far less risky. Labeling someone as disloyal shuts down inquiry by turning scrutiny into suspicion, and suspicion into fear, all without ever addressing substance. It is effective precisely because it exploits the public's understandable desire for security, even as it undermines trust in the process meant to provide it. And when that tactic fails, as it begins to fail here, the entire performance starts to wobble. Pelosi's confidence does not evaporate instantly, but it tightens, becoming more rigid as she senses the ground shifting beneath her narrative. Gabbard continues to speak in measured tones, carefully avoiding the trap of sounding vindictive, because vindictiveness would let critics dismiss her as emotional. Instead, she sounds methodical, as though she has prepared not for applause but for documentation. This is the moment when the hearing stops feeling like theater and starts feeling like exposure. And exposure is what power fears most. The audience leans in, not because they know what will be revealed next, but because they sense that whatever it is will not be easily erased. The controversial questions multiply quietly in living rooms across the country, whispered between viewers or typed into comment sections in real time. Why does questioning war policy trigger accusations of foreign sympathy? And who benefits when debate is framed as betrayal? Why does experience become a shield rather than a qualification? And when did longevity in power start to substitute for accountability? Why does the language of patriotism appear most often when money, influence, or reputation feels threatened? These questions linger because they cannot be dismissed as partisan, even if partisans try. Gabbard's composure begins to function as a mirror, reflecting the tension back onto those who expected to control the exchange. Pelosi, accustomed to being the center of gravity, now finds herself responding rather than directing, and that role reversal is destabilizing. The room feels heavier, as though everyone senses that lines are being crossed that cannot easily be uncrossed. This is not a collapse, not yet, but it is a moment of recalibration, and recalibration is often the prelude to reckoning. By the time this opening phase concludes, the audience understands that the accusation of disloyalty was never the main event, but the spark meant to prevent one. What follows will not be about shouting or slogans, because those are the tools of distraction, not resolution. It will be about how power reacts when its usual weapons fail, and what happens when someone refuses to play the expected role of the accused. If you're wondering why this exchange feels different from the countless hearings that blur together in memory, it's because something fundamental has shifted. The conversation has moved from identity to conduct, from accusation to evidence, and from theater to consequence. And that shift, once made in public, is almost impossible to reverse. Pelosi does not immediately escalate after the first exchange, because she has survived long enough in Washington to know that momentum can be reclaimed if you appear composed while waiting for the other side to overreach. She leans back slightly, adjusts her papers, and speaks with the practiced patience of someone signaling that she has weathered storms far worse than this one. To the casual viewer, it looks like restraint, but to anyone fluent in congressional power dynamics, it is recalculation happening in real time. She reframes her concern as institutional rather than personal, repeating words like stability, norms, and alliance credibility, as if repetition itself could rebuild authority. This is the Pelosi method at its most refined, where volume is replaced by seniority and disagreement is quietly reframed as irresponsibility. She reminds the room of her decades of service, not explicitly, but through implication. The way a monarch never has to say they are king. She speaks of intelligence briefings she has attended, crises she has managed, and the burden of decisions made when no option was clean. Every sentence is designed to suggest that dissent from her worldview is not merely wrong, but naive, the kind of naivete that could get people hurt. The subtle insult embedded in this framing is that experience itself confers correctness, and that those without it should listen rather than question. It is an argument that has kept many careers afloat, because it preys on the fear that the system might actually be fragile. Yet something curious happens as she speaks, because the audience's attention does not fully return to her. The camera cuts back to Gabbard repeatedly, and each time it does, the contrast deepens rather than softens. Gabbard listens intently, not with the expression of someone cowed, but with the focus of someone evaluating a claim rather than absorbing it. That distinction matters because it signals to viewers that the exchange is no longer about authority, but about credibility. And credibility, unlike authority, cannot be asserted into existence. When Gabbard responds again, she does not contradict Pelosi's resume because doing so would validate the hierarchy Pelosi depends on. Instead, she questions the assumption that longevity equals legitimacy, and she does so without mocking it, which makes the challenge harder to dismiss. She acknowledges experience as valuable, but insists that experience without accountability becomes insulation rather than wisdom. This is a dangerous argument in Washington, because it implies that the very thing leaders trade on may also be their greatest vulnerability. The room grows quieter, not because people are confused, but because they understand the implication and are unsure how to counter it. Pelosi senses this and pivots again, this time leaning on consensus, invoking allies, shared assessments, and the collective judgment of institutions. She implies that Gabbard's views are outliers, and that outliers in national security are inherently risky. It is a softer accusation than disloyalty, but it serves the same function, isolating the target by surrounding the speaker with imagined unanimity. The humor, if you can call it that, lies in how often consensus is invoked precisely when it is most fragile. Viewers at home can almost feel the strain in the word itself, stretched thin by overuse. Gabbard's response lands differently because she refuses to apologize for standing outside the consensus. She frames dissent as a necessary stress test, arguing that policies unchallenged by serious internal critique are the ones most likely to fail catastrophically. She references history without lecturing, reminding the audience that many of America's most costly decisions were made in rooms full of agreement. This is where her argument begins to resonate beyond partisan lines, because it taps into a shared memory of collective mistakes. The question shifts from whether dissent is dangerous to whether conformity is. Pelosi attempts to redirect toward loyalty once more, but the word now sounds thinner, as though it has lost some of its force. When an accusation fails to produce submission, repeating it only reveals desperation. Gabbard senses this and presses gently, not with allegations, but with hypotheticals that invite the audience to draw uncomfortable parallels. She asks what happens when power becomes so concentrated that questioning it feels like treason rather than responsibility. The room stiffens because the question does not need an answer to be unsettling. At this stage, the exchange acquires an almost ironic tone, because Pelosi's effort to assert control highlights the very imbalance Gabbard is describing. The more Pelosi leans on institutional weight, the more viewers notice how unevenly that weight is distributed. The hearing begins to resemble a case study rather than a debate, with Gabbard narrating dynamics that the audience can actively observe. This is not theatrical humor, but situational irony. And it lands because it feels earned, rather than forced. People laugh quietly at home, not because something is funny, but because recognition often masquerades as amusement. Pelosi's allies interject, raising points of order and procedural clarifications, attempting to slow the exchange and fragment Gabbard's momentum. These interruptions are polite but frequent, and they serve to remind viewers that power can always buy time, even when it cannot buy trust. Gabbard accommodates the interruptions without frustration, which only strengthens her position, because composure under disruption reads as confidence. Each time she resumes, she picks up exactly where she left off, reinforcing the impression that she is driving the conversation rather than reacting to it. This steadiness becomes part of the argument itself. The audience begins asking more pointed questions, not just about Pelosi or Gabbard, but about the system that produces these encounters. Why do hearings so often feel like performances designed to protect reputations rather than uncover truth? Why are accusations easier to make than answers are to provide? And why does dissent trigger suspicion faster than failure triggers accountability? These questions hang over the room like a low ceiling, pressing down on every exchange. Pelosi responds by emphasizing unity, especially in an era of global uncertainty, framing dissent as a luxury the nation cannot afford. It is a powerful rhetorical move, because fear is always more persuasive when dressed as prudence. But Gabbard counters by arguing that unity built on silence is not unity at all, but enforced agreement that eventually fractures under pressure. She suggests that real strength comes from resilience, and resilience requires honest internal debate. The audience senses that these are not abstract principles, but competing philosophies of power. My own view crystallizes here because this moment exposes a core tension in American politics that extends far beyond these two women. There is a growing divide between those who believe stability comes from preserving hierarchies and those who believe it comes from subjecting them to constant review. Pelosi represents the former, a model where experience justifies authority and authority demands deference. Gabbard represents the latter, a model where authority is provisional and experience must be continually re-earned. Neither model is without risk, but pretending only one exists is the real danger. As the exchange continues, Pelosi's language becomes more defensive, though still polished, signaling that she senses control slipping. Gabbard's language becomes more precise, narrowing the focus from abstract ideals to practical consequences. She speaks about trust not as something declared, but as something demonstrated through transparency and consistency. This is where the debate subtly tilts, because viewers trust processes more than proclamations, and once trust shifts, authority often follows. The room feels heavier now, charged with the realization that this hearing will not end neatly. Pelosi's attempts to restore the familiar rhythm fail to fully take hold, because the audience has seen behind the curtain. Gabbard has not accused Pelosi of anything explicitly yet, but she has laid the groundwork for something more consequential. By questioning the framework rather than the person, she has made it difficult to dismiss what comes next as personal animus. The stage is set, not for spectacle, but for exposure. By the end of this phase, the accusation of disloyalty that opened the hearing feels almost secondary. What matters now is the broader implication that loyalty tests are often deployed when systems fear examination. Pelosi remains formidable, but her aura of inevitability has cracked, and once cracked, it cannot easily be repaired. Gabbard has not claimed victory, but she has shifted the terrain, and terrain matters more than any single exchange. As the hearing moves forward, the audience understands that the real conflict has only just begun. The third phase of the exchange opens with a noticeable change in pacing, the kind that only happens when both sides realize the ground rules have quietly shifted beneath them. What had begun as a clash over loyalty and legitimacy now feels more like a slow dissection of how power actually protects itself when challenged from inside its own walls. Pelosi no longer speaks as if she is instructing the room, but as if she is guarding something that might slip away if not carefully defended. Gabbard, by contrast, appears increasingly comfortable, not because the situation is safe, but because the conversation is finally happening on terrain she understands. This is where the hearing stops being about posture and starts being about exposure. Pelosi tries to regain narrative control by broadening the scope, pulling the conversation back to global threats, hostile actors, and the fragility of American influence abroad. She invokes adversaries without naming them, allowing fear to do the work that specifics might complicate. It is a familiar move, because vagueness in the name of security often sounds responsible, even when it avoids accountability. Her tone is firm, almost parental, as if warning the room that reckless debate itself can become a vulnerability. The implication is clear. Questioning leadership is a risk multiplier. Gabbard listens, then responds by narrowing the focus instead of expanding it. And that narrowing is deliberate. She does not dispute the existence of threats, because doing so would allow critics to dismiss her as unrealistic. Instead, she questions the logic that treats dissent as a greater danger than failure. She asks why strategic mistakes are so often framed as inevitable, while challenges to those mistakes are framed as suspicious. The room grows quiet again, because this question cuts too close to lived experience for many watching. This is the moment when Gabbard introduces the idea that accountability has been selectively applied, not as an accusation, but as an observable pattern. She references decisions that were later acknowledged as costly without naming names, letting memory fill in the gaps. Viewers at home supply their own examples, wars justified with certainty, policies defended until the damage was undeniable, leaders rarely held personally responsible. By avoiding specifics, she makes the argument universal, and universality is harder to swat away as partisan. Pelosi's expression tightens slightly, a sign that the critique has landed even if it has not been accepted. Pelosi counters by emphasizing complexity, reminding the room that decisions are made with incomplete information under immense pressure. She argues that hindsight criticism ignores the realities of leadership, where certainty is rare and consequences are unavoidable. It is a reasonable defense, and one that resonates with those who value experience precisely because it carries scars. But Gabbard does not reject this premise. She reframes it. She agrees that leadership is difficult, then asks why difficulty so often becomes an excuse for insulation rather than a reason for transparency. That reframing matters because it shifts the moral burden without denying reality. If decisions are hard, she argues, then scrutiny should increase, not decrease. If mistakes are inevitable, then accountability should be shared, not deflected. This logic is simple enough to feel obvious, yet radical enough to threaten established hierarchies. The audience senses this tension and leans in, because it feels like common sense colliding with custom. Pelosi responds by invoking trust, suggesting that constant skepticism erodes the cohesion necessary for effective governance. She warns that a culture of suspicion can paralyze institutions and empower adversaries who exploit internal division. Again, the argument is not frivolous, and that is what makes the exchange compelling rather than cartoonish. But Gabbard counters by distinguishing between skepticism and cynicism, arguing that the former strengthens institutions while the latter corrodes them. She suggests that suppressing skepticism in the name of unity risks creating the very cynicism leaders fear. At this point, the hearing acquires an almost philosophical undertone, as though two competing visions of democracy are quietly debating each other. One vision prioritizes stability through continuity, trusting that experienced hands will steer the ship even through unseen storms. The other prioritizes resilience through challenge, trusting that systems exposed to pressure are less likely to fail catastrophically. Neither vision is inherently malicious, but they produce very different incentives and outcomes. The audience begins to realize that this confrontation is less personal than structural. The humor that creeps in here is subtle and slightly uncomfortable, born from the recognition that these debates have happened before, often with similar language and similar outcomes. Viewers joke online that they could predict the next line from either side, and that predictability itself becomes part of the critique. Pelosi sounds like the voice of institutional memory, steady and cautious. Gabbard sounds like the voice of institutional frustration, calm but insistent. The irony is that both voices claim to protect democracy, yet define protection in opposite ways. Pelosi attempts to reassert authority by drawing clear lines, suggesting that certain debates belong behind closed doors rather than in public forums. She frames transparency as something that must be balanced against security, implying that too much openness can be as dangerous as secrecy. Gabbard responds by questioning who decides where that line is drawn and whether those decisions are themselves subject to review. This question unsettles the room because it challenges not a policy, but a privilege. The privilege of deciding what the public is allowed to know. As this exchange unfolds, the audience's role becomes more apparent because viewers are no longer just watching, they are evaluating. They compare tone, consistency, and willingness to engage rather than deflect. They notice how often Pelosi speaks in abstractions and how often Gabbard returns to principles that feel grounded in lived experience. This does not mean one is lying and the other is truthful, but it does affect perception. And perception, in politics, often matters more than intent. Pelosi's frustration surfaces briefly, not as anger, but as firmness sharpened by impatience. She reiterates that leadership requires trust, and that trust cannot survive endless internal doubt. Gabbard counters by arguing that trust imposed from above is fragile, while trust earned through openness is durable. This distinction resonates with viewers who have watched institutions lose credibility through secrecy rather than debate. The exchange feels less like a clash of personalities and more like a referendum on governance itself. My own perspective becomes clearer here, because this moment illustrates how often political conflict is framed as ideological when it is actually procedural. The fight is not over what America should want, but over how decisions about those wants are made and defended. Pelosi represents a system that equates dissent with risk because it prioritizes control. Gabbard represents a challenge to that system, arguing that control without accountability eventually undermines legitimacy. Both positions carry consequences, but only one acknowledges the cost of suppressing questions. The audience begins to sense that Pelosi's strongest defense, her experience, is also her constraint. She cannot easily concede the need for deeper scrutiny without undermining the framework she helped build. Gabbard, with less institutional investment, can afford to question that framework openly. This asymmetry shapes the exchange, giving Gabbard freedom and Pelosi caution. And freedom, when exercised calmly, often reads as confidence. As the third phase draws to a close, the energy in the room feels heavier, but clearer. The accusation that started the hearing has receded into the background, replaced by a more unsettling conversation about how power responds to challenge. Pelosi remains composed, but the ease with which she once commanded the narrative is gone. Gabbard has not landed a dramatic blow, but she has accomplished something more difficult, which is shifting the audience's frame of reference. They are no longer asking who is loyal, but who is accountable. This shift does not resolve the conflict, but it changes its trajectory. From here on, every attempt to dismiss dissent as dangerous will sound less convincing. Every appeal to authority will invite questions about process rather than obedience. The hearing has crossed a threshold, moving from symbolic confrontation into substantive inquiry. And once that threshold is crossed, returning to business as usual becomes nearly impossible. By the time the fourth movement of this confrontation begins, something subtle but decisive has already changed, and everyone in the room can feel it even if no one says it out loud. The exchange is no longer driven by sharp accusations or defensive clarifications, but by a quiet recalibration of power, the kind that happens when one side realizes the old scripts no longer work the way they used to. Pelosi is still composed, still authoritative, but the authority now has to work harder to justify itself. Gabbard, meanwhile, is no longer pushing. She is letting the implications of what has already been said do the work for her. This is the phase where silence between sentences becomes as important as the sentences themselves. Pelosi opens this stretch by attempting to anchor the conversation back in institutional language, invoking committees, procedures, and historical precedent. She speaks about systems built over decades, about norms designed to prevent chaos rather than generate headlines. Her argument is that these systems, while imperfect, have preserved stability through eras far more volatile than the present one. The subtext is unmistakable. Dismantling trust in these structures risks consequences that cannot easily be reversed. It is a warning, delivered calmly, but it is a warning nonetheless. Gabbard responds without urgency, which is precisely what makes her reply effective. She acknowledges the value of institutions, even praises the intent behind their creation, but then introduces a distinction that alters the equation. Institutions, she says, are not synonymous with virtue, and longevity does not guarantee integrity. She suggests that systems can persist not because they are just, but because they are insulated from challenge. This idea lands quietly, but it lands deep. The audience senses that the conversation has shifted from whether mistakes happened to whether the mechanisms designed to address mistakes are functioning at all. Pelosi emphasizes experience again, framing it as earned authority that deserves deference rather than suspicion. Gabbard counters by reframing experience as responsibility rather than entitlement. She asks why accumulated power so often results in diminished scrutiny instead of heightened accountability. The question is delivered gently, but it reverberates because it reflects a frustration many viewers recognize. At this point, humor slips in through the back door, not as a joke told aloud, but as a shared recognition among the audience. Online, viewers remark that they have heard versions of Pelosi's argument for most of their adult lives, and that familiarity itself has become part of the problem. The humor is dry, even bleak, the kind that arises when repetition exposes stagnation. Gabbard does not exploit this directly, but her calm demeanor allows the contrast to speak for itself. The effect is disarming rather than confrontational. Pelosi attempts to pivot by highlighting the dangers of populism, warning that appealing directly to public frustration can erode the safeguards meant to protect minority rights and long-term interests. She frames herself as a bulwark against emotional decision-making, positioning institutional restraint as a moral necessity. It is an argument rooted in fear of volatility, and it resonates with those who remember moments when public anger led to destructive outcomes. But Gabbard reframes populism not as emotional excess, but as a symptom. She argues that when institutions consistently fail to respond to legitimate concerns, people naturally seek alternatives. This reframing shifts responsibility away from the public and back toward leadership. Instead of blaming voters for impatience, Gabbard suggests examining why patience has been exhausted. She emphasizes that transparency and responsiveness are not concessions to anger, but antidotes to it. Pelosi listens, her expression measured, but the tension is visible in the way she holds her posture. The exchange now feels less like debate and more like diagnosis. The conversation turns briefly toward media narratives, with Pelosi criticizing what she calls the simplification of complex issues for consumption. She argues that nuance is sacrificed for engagement, and that this dynamic fuels misunderstanding. Gabbard agrees, but then adds that simplification becomes dangerous only when it replaces honesty. She notes that complexity is often invoked selectively, usually when explanations would expose uncomfortable truths. This observation earns a low murmur of recognition from the audience. Pelosi responds by asserting that leadership sometimes requires shielding the public from information that could be misused or misinterpreted. It is a paternal argument, grounded in caution rather than contempt, but it still assumes a hierarchy of understanding. Gabbard challenges this assumption by questioning whether withholding information actually prevents misuse or merely concentrates power among those already insulated. She suggests that informed citizens are less vulnerable to manipulation than those kept in the dark. The implication is that secrecy breeds the very instability leaders claim to fear. Here, my own assessment sharpens, because this is the crux of the conflict playing out beneath the surface. Pelosi's worldview treats stability as fragile, requiring careful management by experienced hands. Gabbard's worldview treats legitimacy as fragile, requiring constant renewal through openness. Both seek to protect democratic systems, but they prioritize different threats, and the choice between them has consequences far beyond this room. The audience begins to sense that Pelosi is defending not just a position, but a legacy. Her language reflects the weight of decades spent navigating power, compromises, and incremental progress. Gabbard, by contrast, speaks with the clarity of someone less entangled in those compromises. This does not make one noble and the other corrupt, but it does explain their divergence. The tension is not moral, but structural. Pelosi's tone grows firmer as she warns against destabilizing reforms pursued without consensus. She frames change as something that must be carefully negotiated rather than demanded. Gabbard responds by questioning whether consensus is possible when dissenting voices are routinely marginalized. She argues that calls for patience often function as mechanisms for delay rather than dialogue. This resonates with viewers who feel perpetually told to wait while outcomes remain unchanged. A brief moment of levity emerges when Gabbard notes, almost offhandedly, that Washington has perfected the art of endless discussion without resolution. The line draws soft laughter, not because it is witty, but because it feels painfully accurate. Pelosi smiles politely, but the humor carries an edge that cannot be ignored. It highlights the gap between process and outcome that defines so much public frustration. The laughter fades quickly, replaced by a thoughtful hush. As this part unfolds, it becomes clear that Pelosi's strength, her command of institutional logic, is also her vulnerability. She cannot easily concede the need for structural change without undermining the very systems she champions. Gabbard, less invested in those systems, can afford to question them openly. This asymmetry shapes the dynamic, giving one side caution and the other agility. And in moments of public reckoning, agility often reads as honesty. The exchange slows as both speakers seem to recognize the depth of the divide. Pelosi emphasizes continuity, warning that tearing down frameworks without clear alternatives risks unintended harm. Gabbard emphasizes renewal, arguing that frameworks unable to withstand scrutiny are already failing. Neither side retreats, but neither escalates either. The conflict settles into a tense equilibrium. By the end of this segment, the audience understands that this is no longer about winning the moment. It is about defining what accountability looks like in a system designed to diffuse responsibility. Pelosi has defended the logic of the institution with discipline and gravity. Gabbard has exposed the emotional and ethical cost of that logic with restraint. The room is left holding two truths that do not easily coexist. This unresolved tension is what propels the conversation forward. Viewers sense that the next phase will force a reckoning, not through accusation, but through implication. The audience is no longer waiting for a dramatic takedown. They are waiting to see which vision of leadership feels more credible when the abstractions fall away. And that anticipation hangs heavy as the fourth part draws to a close. The fifth stage of this unfolding confrontation arrives with a sense of inevitability, as though the room itself understands that abstraction can only carry the conversation so far before it collapses under its own weight. What began as a philosophical divide now starts pressing toward lived consequences, and that transition is where audiences stop listening politely and start judging personally. Pelosi's posture remains controlled, but there is a noticeable shift in her cadence, a tightening that suggests she knows the margin for rhetorical maneuvering is shrinking. Gabbard, sensing this, does not rush to capitalize, choosing instead to let the silence stretch just long enough to make the next words matter. This is the moment where principles are forced to collide with outcomes. Pelosi attempts to ground the discussion in responsibility, emphasizing that leadership is measured not only by intent, but by the ability to prevent collapse. She speaks about trade-offs, about decisions made between imperfect options, about the burden of choosing the least harmful path rather than an ideal one. Her argument is that critics often underestimate how fragile balance can be, especially in moments of crisis. It is a defense rooted in caution, and it resonates with viewers who fear sudden upheaval more than slow decay. But it also carries an implicit demand for forgiveness. Gabbard responds by acknowledging the weight of those decisions, but she reframes the question in a way that shifts responsibility back toward those who hold power. She asks whether preventing collapse should absolve leaders from explaining why collapse was even possible. She suggests that repeated appeals to necessity can quietly erode accountability, turning extraordinary measures into routine habits. The point is not accusatory, but analytical, and that makes it harder to dismiss as emotional or ideological. The audience leans in because this feels like a question they have asked themselves. The exchange turns toward consequences, not theoretical ones, but human ones. Gabbard speaks about communities that experience policy not as debate, but as disruption, displacement, or loss. She avoids dramatic language, choosing instead to describe these effects plainly, which paradoxically gives them more weight. Pelosi listens, then responds by emphasizing mitigation efforts, safety nets, and incremental improvements. It is a familiar pattern: harm acknowledged, responsibility diffused. Here, the tension becomes palpable because both are speaking truthfully from within their frameworks. Yet the frameworks do not align. Pelosi's answers suggest that harm is regrettable but unavoidable, a cost of governing at scale. Gabbard's questions suggest that inevitability is often invoked too quickly before alternatives are seriously considered. The difference is subtle but consequential, and viewers sense that this is not a disagreement that can be resolved with a sound bite. It is a disagreement about what leaders owe the people affected by their decisions. Humor surfaces briefly, almost accidentally, when Gabbard notes that Washington has a remarkable ability to declare lessons learned while repeating the same patterns. The line draws a ripple of laughter, not because it is clever, but because it feels uncomfortably accurate. Pelosi smiles thinly, acknowledging the remark without engaging it. The humor serves as a pressure valve, releasing tension while sharpening the critique. It reminds the audience that repetition without reform is itself a choice. Pelosi pivots toward unity again, stressing that public trust depends on confidence in leadership. She argues that relentless criticism risks weakening the collective resolve needed to navigate uncertain times. Gabbard counters by distinguishing between confidence and complacency, suggesting that trust built on omission is brittle. She argues that citizens are more resilient than leaders often assume, capable of grappling with complexity if given honest information. This exchange reframes trust not as something demanded, but as something earned. At this point, my own perspective becomes harder to ignore, because this debate mirrors a pattern repeated across decades of American political life. Institutions defend themselves by warning of chaos, while challengers warn of stagnation. Pelosi embodies a system that equates continuity with responsibility. Gabbard challenges that equation, arguing that continuity without correction eventually undermines legitimacy. Neither position is reckless, but only one actively invites scrutiny. The audience's role shifts again here, from observers to implicit participants. Viewers begin to ask themselves which argument aligns more closely with their experiences, not their ideology. They recall moments when they were told to be patient, to trust the process, only to watch outcomes remain unchanged. They also recall moments when instability caused real harm, validating Pelosi's caution. The tension is not resolved, but it is clarified. Pelosi's frustration becomes more visible, not through raised voice, but through emphasis. She reiterates that governance is not activism, that compromise is not weakness, and that purity tests can paralyze progress. Gabbard responds by agreeing that compromise is necessary, then asks who bears the cost when compromise consistently favors the same interests. The question lands heavily, because it challenges not a policy, but a pattern. It suggests that compromise, like accountability, can be unevenly distributed. A brief exchange about generational responsibility follows, with Pelosi invoking historical progress achieved through patience and persistence. She frames her career as evidence that gradual change can yield lasting results. Gabbard respects that history, but notes that patience looks different to those who have waited their entire lives for relief. She suggests that invoking past victories should not excuse present inertia. The room grows quiet, because the argument touches something deeply personal for many watching. The conversation edges toward moral responsibility without ever naming it directly. Pelosi speaks of duty to protect the whole, even when individual grievances cannot be immediately addressed. Gabbard speaks of duty to confront systems that normalize those grievances as collateral damage. Both appeal to ethics, but from opposing directions. The audience feels the weight of choosing between them. Another moment of restrained humor appears when Gabbard remarks that Washington excels at convening panels to discuss problems it already understands. The line earns a few knowing chuckles, quickly suppressed. Pelosi responds with a measured nod, neither agreeing nor objecting. The humor functions as a mirror, reflecting frustration without turning it into mockery. It keeps the critique within bounds while sharpening its edge. As this segment nears its end, it becomes clear that Pelosi is defending more than policy. She is defending a philosophy of governance shaped by survival within power structures. Gabbard, in contrast, is articulating a philosophy shaped by distance from those structures. This difference explains their tones, their priorities, and their blind spots. The exchange is no longer about persuasion, but about exposure. Each is revealing the limits of the other's worldview. The audience senses that something has shifted irreversibly. Pelosi's arguments remain coherent, but they feel increasingly protective rather than visionary. Gabbard's arguments feel disruptive, but also clarifying. Neither has landed a decisive blow, yet the balance has tilted perceptibly. Viewers are no longer weighing who sounds more authoritative, but who sounds more honest. As the fifth part closes, the atmosphere is heavy with anticipation rather than resolution. The questions raised here cannot be answered within the confines of a single exchange. They linger, pressing against the edges of institutional comfort. The audience understands that the final phase will not be about winning, but about reckoning. And that expectation settles over the room like a held breath, waiting for what comes next. The final stage does not arrive with an explosion, but with something far more unsettling: clarity. By this point, the audience understands that no dramatic gesture will resolve what has been exposed, because the argument has moved beyond personalities and into structure. The tension in the room is quieter now, heavier, as though everyone present recognizes that they are watching an ending rather than a climax. Pelosi sits straighter, composed but unmistakably guarded, aware that history is no longer something she can frame, only something she must endure. Gabbard, by contrast, appears almost restrained, as if she knows that pushing harder would dilute the force of what has already landed. Pelosi makes one last attempt to reclaim moral authority, not by attacking, but by contextualizing. She speaks of decades spent navigating crises, of choices made under pressure, of trade-offs invisible to those outside the room. Her tone suggests exhaustion rather than defiance, an appeal to understanding rather than absolution. She frames her career as evidence that imperfect systems can still yield progress when guided by experienced hands. It is a closing argument built on endurance. Gabbard listens without interruption, allowing the words to settle before responding. When she speaks, she does not challenge Pelosi's experience or deny the complexity of leadership. Instead, she asks whether experience alone should insulate leaders from scrutiny when outcomes repeatedly fall short. She suggests that longevity in power can blur the line between stewardship and self-preservation. The question is delivered calmly, but it reverberates. This is where the debate transcends policy and becomes existential. Pelosi represents a generation of leadership that equates survival within the system with responsibility to the system. Gabbard represents a challenge to that assumption, arguing that survival without reform eventually corrodes legitimacy. Neither position is cartoonish, and that is precisely why the moment feels so consequential. The audience is forced to confront not which woman they prefer, but which vision they are willing to live with. A subtle shift occurs in the room as observers realize that Pelosi is no longer arguing against Gabbard alone. She is, in effect, arguing against a growing skepticism that experience without transparency is enough. Her words still carry authority, but that authority feels inherited rather than earned in real time. Gabbard's responses, though less commanding, feel rooted in a demand for alignment between rhetoric and reality. The contrast is no longer sharp. It is structural. I find myself siding not with certainty, but with discomfort. Political systems that function only when shielded from hard questions eventually fracture under their own contradictions. What Gabbard articulates, intentionally or not, is a refusal to treat discomfort as danger. She treats it instead as evidence that something unresolved is finally being named. That approach carries risk, but also honesty. Pelosi's final remarks emphasize stability, warning that relentless questioning can erode institutions faster than it improves them. It is a familiar caution, one that has preserved order through countless storms. Yet it also assumes that institutions erode primarily from external pressure rather than internal decay. Gabbard's silence after this point is telling. She does not counter with another argument. She allows the warning to stand, trusting the audience to weigh it against what they have witnessed. A moment of unintended humor surfaces when a pause stretches slightly too long and someone in the gallery coughs. The sound cuts through the gravity, reminding everyone that this is not a scripted drama, but a human exchange. A few restrained smiles flicker and disappear. The humor is not derisive, it is grounding. It underscores how rare it is to see power questioned without spectacle. As the session draws to a close, there is no clear victor. Pelosi has defended her worldview with discipline and experience. Gabbard has challenged that worldview without resorting to theatrics. The absence of a knockout punch is precisely what makes the encounter linger. It leaves space for reflection rather than applause. The audience's unspoken question shifts from who won to what happens next. Will institutions absorb this critique and adapt, or will they retreat behind procedure and precedent? Will accountability be treated as a threat or as a corrective? These questions extend beyond the two figures at the center of the exchange. They implicate everyone who participates in or benefits from the system. What makes this ending powerful is not outrage, but restraint. Gabbard does not demand agreement, only attention. Pelosi does not concede, but neither does she dismiss the challenge entirely. The exchange ends suspended, unresolved, mirroring the state of public trust itself. It feels unfinished because it is, as viewers step away, they are left with an uncomfortable realization. The sharpest conflicts in politics are no longer about left versus right, but about insulation versus exposure, about whether authority should flow from position alone or from continuous accountability. That realization is harder to monetize, harder to sloganize, but harder still to ignore. And that, more than any accusation or rebuttal, is what gives this moment its lasting weight. The final image is not one of confrontation, but of divergence. Two leaders walking away with fundamentally different understandings of what leadership requires. One rooted in preservation, the other in interrogation. The audience understands that neither path is without cost. The only question that remains is which cost they are prepared to keep paying.